everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Beat. Today, we're going to be talking about human trafficking. Myself and Nancy have worked these cases in the past, and today we want to talk a little bit about the dynamics of human trafficking, some warning signs, how to recognize it, and provide a resource at the end of the podcast.
Yes, and to start it off, what is human trafficking?
So human trafficking is a fairly new concept in the sense that it was introduced by the TVPA Act of 2000, and the TVPA Act has changed a few times ever since. But prior to that, prior to the TVPA Act, it was called prostitution. Like back in the day when I started my career in working with crime victims, there was no such thing as human trafficking. So, human trafficking is a fairly new concept to society, to law enforcement, to the judicial system. And I would say the entity that probably has more or has been involved in human trafficking prior to it being called human trafficking are probably the non governmental agencies, the NGOs, community organizations. Because they've been providing services even before this was identified as human trafficking. But for everyone else, human trafficking tends to be a fairly new concept. It's a concept that sometimes gets caught up in myths or trends that don't necessarily exist or they're not as prevalent. I think people sometimes get their perception of human trafficking from like movies and media and different sources that paint a picture of human trafficking that might not be the most accurate. So today we're going to talk about the cases that we've seen, and hopefully we can talk to you guys about some of the warning signs as well as how to recognize it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, human trafficking is a term often used to refer to the modern day slavery or the slave trade of people, right? A lot of people think of it as an international thing that happens when people cross borders and they are imprisoned by either removing their passports or not giving the legal rights, and they have to pay their way to the United States or to other country by forced labor, right? So that will be the human trafficking that most people recognize the most, I guess, because movies or social media have brought that to the forefront. But this is is a lot broader than that. So the broader definition of human trafficking includes the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force, all the forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, deception, abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of a payment or benefit to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. What does that mean to all of us? That's a lot of words, right? What does that mean to all of us? That means that, let's say, a child really wants some tennis shoes that cost like $200, and parents say, no, you're not going to have it. And then there's somebody on their internet or social media that tells them, I'll buy them for you because we're friends. We've been playing video games together for a long period of time. I'm just going to give them to you because, I care about you. And how dare your parents that they don't love you enough to buy you these tennis shoes? Because, in today's society, children or young adults, teenagers, are so impressed by social media and by having a status on social media. And so they want the latest and greatest all the time. And so when a parent doesn't give in, it may or may not, cause this child to find it in other means, in other ways. And so let's say this kid, been playing video games with this person, and now this person says, "I'll buy them for you. Don't worry, I'll just give them to you." And then they start giving them gifts. They start earning their trust. This is the grooming process, earning their trust, talking bad about their parents. The parents don't understand them. The parents don't listen to them. Things like that, until they are so indebted to this person that at one point or another they even ask them for pictures, nude pictures of themselves, videos, or even sexual favors. And so causing the exploitation of this child by this person. That is human trafficking. A lot of people do not understand that that is human trafficking. And so I wanted to put that example into perspective. How else can you see human trafficking, Renata?
Yeah, so all of those elements, like what you mentioned, like force, fraud, and coercion, those elements do need to exist in terms of when we're talking about human trafficking with adults. But when it comes to human trafficking with minors, um, those elements don't necessarily need to be met. There just needs to be an exchange of something. So, for instance, like when you mentioned how kids now in society sometimes get caught up in um, status or wanting to have certain things at their age that perhaps mom and dad are not providing. Um, you know, those things, or the dynamic, it exists, unfortunately. And most people think of human trafficking as that can only happen to a foreign national. But the reality is that most of the cases that I've seen of human trafficking involve um, um, non-foreign nationals, people that are victims that are already here in our communities. Um, they don't necessarily need to cross borders, although sometimes with human trafficking, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this a little later, Nancy, is the transportation and the movement of these things happening in different states, um, people being moved around um, to run this circuit, and so when with human trafficking, I think it's important to point out that it doesn't necessarily look one way. Um, it's not like how you see it in the movies. It could be something as simple as the dynamics that we see in young people now, that can put them in a place where they're vulnerable and being taken advantage of. Um, a lot of the cases that I've seen in human trafficking tend to be children or young adults that come from the system or in the system. A lot of runaways, a lot of people that have substance abuse issues, whether it's drugs, alcohol, or any other addictions, and people with mental health issues as well. Those are the ones. Those are the populations that I tend to see in the human trafficking cases that I work with, which is alarming, right? Because I mean, when you think about it, most people think of human trafficking as something sort of foreign, like that couldn't really happen to here in our community. Like there shouldn't be. We don't have that population of folks here, right? But the reality is that the human trafficking that you see in the judicial system, the victims tend to be young. They tend to be from the system, the foster care system. They tend to be mentally ill or um, addicted, having some kind of addiction. And some people say, well, the addiction comes or the drugs come or the alcohol comes once they become victims and they get introduced to these substances in order to be able to stand the conditions of the human trafficking. Um, Unfortunately, that's not really what I've seen. I've seen people that engage in human trafficking, they become more vulnerable because they do have an addiction. And so the trafficker takes advantage of that by feeding that addiction. And in return, the victim has to perform certain sexual acts for profit. So anyway, the reason why I point that out is because I think it's important for us to really be open about the trends and the populations that are more at risk. If we wanted to spot it and if we really want to prevent it, we really need to get to the root of the problem. What is causing this victim to be vulnerable? Um, and address it. I think that's one of the pieces that we can do in terms of prevention.
Absolutely. I think we have to be more communicative with our children, with our teens, with our young adults to make sure what kind of vulnerabilities they may be around that people could potentially exploit, because is very easy to exploit someone who hasn't experienced too many things, and so it's just being aware and having that communication also works, to be able to help, not let our children and teens, or young adults to fall into this category of exploitation, because unfortunately statistically, I think you said it before too, is that we see people that are more vulnerable, those young kids up to the age of like young adult that get exploited for human trafficking. And so where can we see human trafficking? In my opinion, I've seen it in massage parlors and all across Florida. I used to see that a lot. These massage parlors that are legally doing business, but introduce people to do sexual acts into these massage parlors. I have seen it as in prostitution. You will think that that person is prostituting themselves, and then find out that they have been exploited, used for sex without their consent. Right? They're being forced to do those things or coerced to doing those things. Like Renata said, because they want to have that fix, and so they'll do whatever they need to get the fix from the person who is exploiting them. And then you have, I've seen it also in like strip clubs or clubs where people will bring these people into it. And lately we have seen that there's like parties or things where these people will exploit children and bring them up. Actually, there's one particular place that where you see it a lot is the Super Bowl. Actually, Super Bowl was one of the most places where people, traffickers, will bring children or young adults to exploit them because people want to go party after their team has won the Super Bowl, and they bring them to those areas to be sold. And it's unfortunate because you see it a lot in places where there's maybe gambling or parties or things like that, where people want to have a good time, and these people that are exploiting will bring them for them to be sold. And so you have to be very aware, very cognizant on what to look for around you, and being aware of that. Also, I think Renata alluded to it, is the traffickers know where to go. So establish hotels that are in the interstate that connects between states. A highway that connects between states is very important to them. They will do the trafficking in those hotels because it's easy to move that child from state to state, and it's very important because they know if once they take that child away from a parent and they ran away, that person is gonna, if that parent cares about their child, obviously it will report it, and there will be an Amber Alert. It is easier for them to go into a highway that connects them to another state and move the person from that state. And that will make it a lot harder from a cop perspective to be talking to the other jurisdiction. They know jurisdictions. So that's why it's very easy for them to move them. And now the jurisdiction is not there. And it's harder from one cop entity to talk to the other one, and it takes time between those to come in alignment with one another. And so they exploit that problem that we have in this country, that every state has its own laws, each state has its own perspective on things. And in some states, the legal age for a child to have sex is different from state to state. And so they will take kids to a state where the legal age is 16, so they could sell this child, and nobody will be questioning if that person is out there by themselves and things like that. So traffickers are very smart, and so going into the hotels that are in those areas, it is the easiest way. But how can we spot when somebody is being trafficked, Miss Renata? What are some of the signs that we could see?
Um, well, I think in order for us to, one of the things that I do want to mention when we dive into how do we spot it is, we also have to understand a little bit of the dynamic between the trafficker and the victim. When we talk about the root of what is causing the victim to be engaged in this type of activity or become vulnerable to this type of activity, um, it's a little similar to the dynamic that you see in sexual abuse cases and domestic violence cases, in terms that there tends to be a level of loyalty sometimes between the trafficker and the victim. And so why I mention this is because a lot of times victims won't necessarily self-identify and ask for help, um, or they might not view themselves as victims. It might take them a little while to um, come to the realization of that they're being victimized. And a lot of it has to do with that sympathy dynamic between them and the perpetrator, because there is a process of grooming that takes place, right? Whether it is by the person gaining the victim's trust as a maybe boyfriend girlfriend type of relationship, or maybe as a protector or a supplier in their basic needs, or the supplier of um, in treating whatever addiction might be um, in the scenarios. So there we need to understand that a lot of times victims are not necessarily, it takes them a while, I guess, um, to be able to accept that the assistance and leave that situation. It doesn't necessarily always, um, the minute that you identify or ask or um, try to get them assistance, then they might not be receptive to it at the beginning. But that's because of that dynamic that takes place, or that grooming process that's already taken place. Um, so we do need to be aware that that dynamic happens, in order to be patient, I guess, in terms of sometimes victims might not come forward, or they might not want to leave the situation the very first time that they have the ability to do it. So I think that's also one of the myths about human trafficking. The victims are so happy to see you and they're ready to escape that situation. And that's not always the case. That's not to discourage people to continue to offer assistance. So,
Absolutely, absolutely, because they have been brainwashed, and they have that Stockholm kind of syndrome that we talk about. that this is their savior, this is the person they could trust, this is the person who watches out for them. So it's kind of hard for them to leave that situation. Absolutely, I agree with that.
Yeah. So that's one point, that um the control doesn't necessarily mean like physical control. It could be like an emotional tie that's there, or a psychological. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to spot it in terms of something physical, although you can sometimes. And so some of the physical signs that you can see is the person not having control of their own money, their phones, their documents. They constantly having to check in with the individual, with the perpetrator, and they don't have the ability to move around as freely as a person um, who's not a victim of human trafficking. So there could be some psychological and emotional controls there that maybe takes a little bit longer to spot versus the physical. The physical would be, like I mentioned, things that you can see in terms of the person not being able to move around or make their own decisions or have control of their something basic as their own money or their own resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I think fearful or submissive behaviors toward that person, maybe a sign, lack of freedom of movement, like you said, controlled by someone else, controlled by telling them, like, or constantly telling them what to do, or them looking for reassurance when somebody asks them a question and they look to the perpetrator to answer that question. So they're not even able to answer that for themselves. They may be distrustful of you and the authorities because they have said that they don't want it, the best for them. Threat of violence or harm, we may see those things. Physical injuries may or may not be present because, sometimes those bruises or things may not be in a place that you could see with clothes on. Branding or tattoos, I've known of some branding things that have happened, but that is not a common thing. That is more that is not something that I've seen in the common parts of that.
I haven't seen it either,
Yeah,
Nancy.
I
And
haven't.
um, you hear about that a lot, the branding,
Hmm.
but I can tell you, I worked these cases for many years, and I've never seen a case
Yeah,
involving branding.
yeah, I haven't.
But
I haven't.
yeah,
I've
it
heard of it.
happens. I'm
Yeah.
sure it happens, but not to the degree where, like you said, where like it has to be present.
Yeah,
Never seen
no,
a
because
case
sometimes what
where.
happens, I think the branding comes when there's a gang that owns this person, maybe. I think that that's what the branding comes from, but I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen it yet, but I know that it's there. Um, so I just mentioned it just because it's something that I've known that is there, but I don't know. I haven't seen
Yeah,
it in my own stuff.
same here. I haven't seen it either, as
Yeah.
much.
And then, coached, they might be coached on what to say, what to order. I mean, you see total control of this person, like you said. And so it is, not having the opportunity to even have a phone or anything like that. So yeah, absolutely. I agree with all that was said in that session. Anything else to say about human trafficking? How can people seek help if they see it? How to report it? Things like that.
Um, so I think when it comes to the investigation, there's so many like nonprofit organizations that help uh, human trafficking victims. Hopefully, they're not being affected by all the political and budget uncertainty that we're living in these times. But each community tends to have one or more organizations that deal specifically with human trafficking. Um, I think the response when it comes to offering services is probably more advanced than the concept of it in governmental organizations. Although it has grown, I don't know about other states, but like for instance, California even has foster parents that are specially trained on um, how to deal with human trafficking victims. Foster children that come into their homes. So each state also has their own response to human trafficking. I think California is one of the states where we're at the forefront when it comes to human trafficking services, and identifying the populations and the trends in human trafficking, and mobilizing and putting in some resources in place to provide specific assistance to this type of population.
Mhm.
Um, so anyway, what I was going to say, what was the question, Nancy? I'm sorry, I got
No, it's
distracted.
okay. That's very, very good information. Very important to know. Um, if we are witnessing potential human trafficking, or we ourselves are becoming trafficked, how can we reach out? How do we report?
So you can report it to law enforcement. It's human trafficking is a federal crime. Although I wonder, I'm not really sure if the state actually prosecutes human trafficking cases, but I know the federal government does. Um, you can report it to law enforcement, but if the person is not ready to come forward with an actual law enforcement investigation and all of that, and all they want is to receive assistance, um, a really good resource to have is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And it's a 24/7 managed hotline. The number is 1-888-373-7888. Again, the number is 1-888-373-7888. So they're a good resource to have. They have um, the ability to also, they have bilingual staff as well. And there's a lot of information that the public can access through their website. But definitely that phone number can get the victim linked with the appropriate resource in their state or the community that they're in. So that would be a good number to have if they were to come across a human trafficking victim, or that themselves are ready to receive some assistance.
Yeah, absolutely. So the main idea, the main point is, if you see it, um, see if you could have that person isolated from the perpetrator, so you could have the chance to talk to them, and listen and be patient. They may not be ready, and so after you feel secure and you're safe, then you may be able to report it. Maybe get some identification of who the person was, and who the potential perpetrator was, maybe a license plate, any information you could provide to report it will be great. I know that I have been in those situations at times, and I've seen them in hotels, interstate hotels, like when I stop for the night because we're going from state to state. I've seen them, and so just making sure to you're safe first, and then make sure that you report those things, and try to get as much information as possible, so when you report it, they have a lead to go by. And Renata, next episode we will talk about we'll talk more about social media and some of the social media crimes that we are seeing now. And then in what's up in the future will be probably domestic violence. Talk about domestic violence, certain signs, certain things to look for, and how to respond to someone who is looking for help but is not ready to leave that perpetrator. So we'll talk more. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, please leave it in our page. Subscribe to our page if you want to listen to it more. What we're trying to do here is provide hope and provide information to educate society about the things that are happening, and provide a little bit of information that you could prevent these things from happening. Renata, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think, and the reason why I think we're going to talk about social media One of the tools that perpetrators are using to recruit human trafficking victims is through social media. So we're going to talk a little bit about trends and resources that the parents can utilize to put some boundaries around social media and internet access around their kids. So stay tuned for the next episode. And if you know of anybody that needs assistance or might be in a human trafficking situation, please call the hotline.
All right. Thank you very much. See you next time.